Hi guys, it's Bill from BK Race Engines. We've been in the engine building business now for 15 years, and today we're going to give you an inside look into one of our 780 cube top sportsman engines. This engine is specifically built for sportsman racing. Sportsman racing is the fast end of dial your own racing. An engine like this is built for a full chassis car that's capable of going 650s on the quarter mile. The benefits of being the high end of the field gives you lane choice. If there's any buy runs, you're going to be the first in the queue to get them. Pro racing, you have to be the fastest, and every thousandth of a second counts. In sportsman racing, if your car's a thousandth off, it just means you've got to just change the number on the window. It's more about the driver, the consistency of the car, the ability, for the driver to cut lights, and like today's sportsman racer, if he's not cutting 015 lights and dialing within 100, he's probably going to lose the race. It's gotten to that point now. We typically would run an engine like this between 80 to 100 passes. In that interval, it's basically just valve spring check and lash check and oil changes. Pro racing is a different level where you're zinging the engine for everything that it's got and more. And yeah, things just aren't going to live forever when you're at that high end. And that's why obviously with sportsmen, it allows guys to race at a budget, and this engine actually has originated from a 500 cubic inch pro stock motor. This thing's got an extra 280 cubic inches. The 280 cubic inches basically mean that the thing makes similar power to a 500 inch pro stock motor, but it also does it with 3,000 less RPM. The rods are going to live longer. The valve springs are going to live longer. The lifters will live longer. Basically, if you look at a pro stock engine, where this thing finishes making power, that's where they start. So that's the biggest difference with the pro motor versus an engine like this. The sportsman guy, his basically biggest concerns are that he's got to put fuel in the car, pack his parachutes. So, he probably spends more time having barbecues while the other people are working. So that would be the biggest difference. The motor is a Chev on steroids. It's been stretched in every direction. 780 cubic inches, 4 3/4 bore, 5.5 inches of stroke. It's a raised cam block. It's got a 65mm cam core in it, well over 11 inches in deck height. The size of the block is just what it needs to house that much stroke in it. There's nothing really special about the block, is that if the block was shorter, you wouldn't be able to swing that much stroke. Obviously, with the amount of counterweight on the crankshaft, the rod has to be such a length to clear the counterweight, and we've got 7.7 inches of conrod in this motor, and it's just because the stroke is so large. Basically, the 5-inch bore space is the only way you're going to get 4 3/4 bore in a motor. You're not going to get it in a smaller bore spacing than this. Basically, with the bore and stroke of this motor, it equates to 1.6 litres of displacement in one cylinder alone. So basically what you're looking at, this motor in the shop right now is 8 4-cylinders parked side by side. And that's why the thing makes the power it makes, because it's just a monster basically. At this power level, a water jacketed alloy block would be suitable. The billet block is obviously stronger, stiffer. The cooling capacity is probably nowhere near as good as a cast block. That would be the plus and minus with both blocks. With the alloy blocks, regardless if it's billet or cast, once it sees heat, there's going to be growth. In an engine like this, when we set the tappets at 0, by the time it gets to operating temp, we'll see 28 thou in the tappet. So basically, we run the lash on this thing at 18 thou. So, when this thing's sitting there cold, it's pressing the valves open already 10 thou. So, a motor of this size, there's 28 thou of growth in the lash just because of the block and the cylinder heads. With the billet block on the street, trying to run this thing in a car with fans and air conditioning and all that, it's not going to happen. You know, the water jacket in this block is minimal, just to allow water to flow through the cylinder heads. It's not the type of coolant passage that's going to allow excessive water through. So it's basically just to keep the temperature equal across the cylinder head, and it wouldn't be for driving it on the street in this particular block. The crankshaft is a Bryant crankshaft. It's custom built to suit the application. It's a reasonably heavy crankshaft. It's not intended to be light. Obviously, when you've got 5.5 inches of stroke, you don't want to be taking a lot of material out of that crankshaft. And the other thing is too, when you've got an engine that's got decent amounts of bob weight hanging off it, you're going to need a decent amount of counterweight to actually oppose that. And this engine also is not intended for a lot of RPM. So, there would be no need to put anything lighter than this. There would be no benefit other than taking strength away from the crankshaft. The conrod in this motor it's a GRP rod. Because of the size of rod, you wouldn't be able to use anything other than an aluminium rod. Total weight of the rod in this motor is just under 800 grams. If you tried to make that rod in steel, it'd probably be 1.5 kilos. So the thing is with this rod, it's equivalent to what you would use in a Pro Mod motor, an 1.94 inch gudgeon pin in it. So all the components in that area are as big as you can physically fit. The piston is a JE piston. It runs a 43, 43 and 3 mil oil ring. The top ring is a gapless ring. The piston's a 4.75 bore. The piston is a flat top piston with just valve pockets. There is no need for anything other than that. With this engine, with the fuel we're using, we're trying to get to that 15.5 to 1 compression. The piston's a gas-ported piston to assist with the top ring seal. With the gas port, it sees compression, and there's a passage that basically comes out of the top of the crown that goes to the back of the top ring. The ring sees the compression that above the piston sees, and basically by doing that, there's no chance of the compression blowing around the ring, because what you see on top is exactly what you see on the side. So it's the only way you're going to seal the ring up successfully. So with the caps, it's a typical 4-bolt design. Because of the wide pan rail on this motor, it allows you to clamp the cap over a very large area. It'd probably be an inch and a half wider than what a typical Chev would be. There wouldn't be anything needed in any additional support. The 4 bolts under the cab bolted to a billet block would be sufficient. The oiling system in this motor is a dry sump system. It runs a 5-stage daily pump. The reason we run a dry sump system is because the amount of G-forces this thing sees in acceleration and deacceleration. A car typically of this caliber would see nearly 3 Gs of acceleration on the release of the trans brake. There's no way you could have the oil housed in a sump and expect it to stay where you want it to stay when you're seeing 3 Gs of acceleration. Obviously, because there's so much mass swinging in the crankcase, you don't want oil in there. There's no chance of not whipping it up because there's so much throw. So the whole purpose of this is trying to get the oil out of the crankcase and basically get it in the can and then get it back around for a second go. In this case, we actually see negative pressure in the crankcase. Not only does it have the dry sump, but it runs a 4-vane vacuum pump to try promote more negative pressure in the crankcase. An engine like this sees about 18 inches of negative crankcase pressure. And in an engine of its size, it would probably be worth anywhere from about 50 to 70 horsepower in that much negative pressure. But with the camshaft in this motor, 580 lobe lift, and then obviously there's a rocker ratio above that. So an engine like this basically runs just over an inch of valve lift. It's a 8620 steel core cam, which is heat treated before ground. The camshaft itself is something that we've worked with bullet cams in the US with. This camshaft basically at 50 thou, it's in excess of 290 at 50 on the intake, and it's over 330 on the exhaust at 50. But it's big, everything's big. It's all about big, With the valvetrain, On this motor, we run a Jessel key lifter. It's a 937 diameter. It's just the weight factor that you don't have to have the link bar and everything else attached to it. In that size, it would be the lightest lifter and also the largest wheel that we can put on a lifter. It's 916 push rod, a Smith Brothers push rod, hardened tipped ends on them. It's got a Jessel rocker, and the rocker itself is a full solid body rocker. There's no lightning provision or anything like that in the rocker. It's as solid as the arm can be. And the fact that this thing doesn't see a lot of RPM, predominantly the stuff is all on the heavier side because we're dealing with so much pressure there. You know, the most we're going to see is probably about 8,000 RPM tops. From that point on, then weight becomes a major factor. So with the valves in this motor, they're a titanium CRN coated valve. The intake valve's just over 2.5 inches in diameter, and the exhaust valves is 1,950 in diameter. And that's where the bore spacing benefits this motor because it allows you to put larger valves in it. You know, the head flows upwards of about 560 CFM on the intake. This engine runs a copper alloy seat. On the intake, obviously because of the amount of flow we're trying to achieve with this thing, we run a 55-degree valve seat on the intake. With the 55-degree seat, the seat life is not high, like it will wear the seat out quickly. But again, with the copper seat, the whole idea of it is that it wears the seat, not the valve. We run a 52-degree seat on the exhaust, and basically with an engine like this, when the thing comes apart for its routine freshen up, the seats definitely need to be recut and so you can go again. The valve spring, it's a PSI spring. It's a drag race spring, DR 1250 spring that we use on this. Basically, it's set up at near 400 on the seat. At peak lift, we're seeing about 1,200 pound of open pressure. So with these cylinder heads, they've come out of CFE in the US. This cylinder head is specific NA head, the port design, the chamber design. It's 11-degree valve angle. So it's specific for an NA engine. We run a copper gasket with an O-ring. In an NA application, we don't see too much trouble with this type of sealing system. Probably the biggest dilemma that you have is that over time you might see some water weepage because there's so much growth. We use a 3-bond product which we actually roll onto the gasket. The headers come in a kit form from Tech Stainless. Basically, he specialises in building headers for these types of motors. So the manifold comes out of HRE. As simple as it looks, there's years and years and years of R&D gone into it. The thing is, these motors are so critical on length, taper, the size of the plenum. It all changes the characteristics in the motor and the way it accelerates, where it makes its power. In this case here, obviously the runners would be longer than what we would traditionally see on a pro stock motor because obviously we're trying to make the power earlier. The plenum size is enough volume there to displace the amount of air that the motor can consume. It's got a pair of carburetors which we've worked in conjunction with Advanced Products Design in the States to help us build these things. Each of these carbs are rated at roughly about 1,250 CFM of air. The calibration been an ongoing thing that we've been working with APD. Drag racing, obviously there's a leaded fuel ban that we're all got to deal with at the moment. And these carburetors were actually tested in the US by APD and shipped over for us to run. The carburetor is obviously the most cost-effective method. What you see on top of this motor is probably $4,500 worth of carburetors. A fuel system that would be able to to fill this or to do the job for a motor like this in EFI. When you start talking ECUs, injectors, and you're probably looking at that $10,000 to $12,000 range. The carburetor can deal with a cylinder that pulls more air because obviously the fuel is atomized up above. If there is a cylinder that's taking more air, it will automatically take more fuel most of the times. With an EFI deal, you need to be compensating for each cylinder individually when you're trying to tune them. In a case like this, where it's drag race, Now the cold starts, the creature comforts you get from EFI would be irrelevant in an engine like this. You know, the carburetor allows you to atomize the fuel to a point where fuel will stay in suspense with the air. In an injected application, the biggest problem that you struggle with is that you're not actually spraying the fuel down the stream. Most of the time just spraying it at a wall. And you know, when you look at supercars and that sort of stuff, obviously with them they're trying to put the injector up top because that's the closest they can get it in amongst the stream. So ignition system, it relies on a crank trigger down the bottom, which obviously is the pickup, and sparks distributed through the belt drive distributor out the front. In a car like this, you know, even on the dyno, we've tuned it for max horsepower, you know, but basically when the thing goes in the car, you know, we're manipulating the timing from end to end, because you know the thing will not hold all the power on the start line. So you know there is a lot of effort put into power management, even though this is just a naturally aspirated engine. In this case here, this thing's going to have a 4-speed Lenco gearbox with a quick drive torque converter. With the oil in this motor, just because of the amount of shear load on the valvetrain components, we didn't want to even contemplate trying to use a mineral oil in it. You know, we chose the best stuff we could get. It's the 540 Racing Synthetic. An engine like this needs to be able to, you know, basically hot lap where, you know, it's done a pass and, you know, you've barely knocked any temp out of it and you know, you're coming back for another hit. As much as it seems like it only goes for 6 seconds, because of what we're trying to do with it, it's quite demanding on the oil. You know, we're obviously looking for a light oil because when this thing starts, it's, you know, it's relatively tight. You know, we need something that can obviously flow when the motor's cold, but also something that when the motor's warm, you know, is stable and we're not seeing massive drop off. And so with the oil, we've broken the motor in. We're, you know, like the break-in procedure is, you know, is probably, you know, near 10 minutes of loaded running, which ultimately we're just putting some pressure on the motor to try settle the rings in. And also allow the valve springs to go through a heat cycle. You know, we're trying to get the motor warm, and then typically what we will do is let the motor cool off and sort of give it like a half an hour just for everything to settle. You know, we want to just sort of get the covers off, make sure we've got no lash issues, we've got no push rods burning or anything crazy like that happening. So we just swooped the motor between, you know, 53 and 7,000. It was probably a 6-second dyno run. And at that point again, you know, covers off, check valve train. Basically the oil has been in this motor. We've had 15 dyno runs and we haven't changed the oil in it. Basically, you know, the plan is we're going to get the filter, cut the filter. But yeah, at this point it will be going in the customer's car. It gets a new load of oil and, you know, the thing will probably do, you know, like, you know, we'll be checking the oil filter routinely, like from meeting to meeting, just to make sure that there's nothing going bad in the motor. But basically, oil-wise, it's probably going to be in there for the first 3 shows. So this engine's made 1,558 horse at 7,500 RPM and 1,206 foot-pound. An engine of this calibre would probably be good enough to see this car go 660s and possibly a 50, you know, in excess of 207, 208 mile an hour.